Story 1. Airports always feel like they're holding their breath. Thousands of people moving at once. Yet somehow it's the silence between announcements that gets under your skin. I used to work night maintenance at Kuala Lumpur International, the kind of job where you mostly walk empty terminals while the rest of the world sleeps. The first few months were peaceful, just the hum of distant conveyor belts and the soft whine of lights that never quite stopped buzzing. But there was one gate tucked at the far end of the old international terminal that made me uneasy every time I passed it. Gate 17. It wasn't special in any way, just another boarding area with rows of faded seats and a big window overlooking the dark tarmac. But everyone knew that was where Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 had departed from before it vanished. The gate had been closed off after the disappearance, but maintenance still had to check it occasionally for power issues and leaks. The higher-ups said it was cheaper than sealing it entirely. The first time I went there alone was about 6 months after I started. The corridor to Gate 17 was darker than the others, the motion lights half dead from years of neglect. My flashlight beam caught the dust hanging thick in the air. There was still a faint outline of the old flight schedule above the doorway. MH370, Beijing. It hadn't been removed. Maybe someone thought it would be disrespectful. The room itself felt wrong, not haunted in the movie sense, just empty in a way that made you hyper-aware of every sound your body made. I could hear my own breathing bouncing back at me. I did a quick sweep, noted the broken vent, replaced a light cover, and started heading back. That's when I heard it, one soft chime from the boarding system, the kind that plays when a gate agent checks a boarding pass. At first I thought it was an echo from the main terminal, but the sound came again, sharper this time, from the desk near the window. The monitor was still dark. There was no power feed connected to it anymore, but the speaker must have held a charge. That was what I told myself anyway. I finished my inspection and got out of there faster than I'd like to admit. A few weeks later, I had to go back. The power readings showed activity in the circuit that fed that section of the terminal. It made no sense because Gate 17 had been disconnected from the main grid years ago. My supervisor laughed it off, saying maybe the system was misreading due to humidity, but he told me to go check it out anyway. Alone, of course. That night, the airport was dead quiet. Even the distant engines on the runway seemed muted by the fog rolling in from the fields. I walked the same corridor again, the same dull hum in my ears. When I reached the gate, something was different. The air was warmer, heavier, like being inside a running engine. I clicked my flashlight on, and it flickered weakly for a moment before stabilizing. The power indicator on the boarding desk was glowing faint green. That shouldn't have been possible. The monitor came to life in front of me, lines of code flashing for a few seconds, then freezing on a black screen with a white prompt. Flight 370, boarding now. I just stood there. It had to be a glitch, maybe an old startup message from before the system was shut down. But the speakers crackled and a soft voice came through. Not a full announcement, just a fragment, like a recording skipping. Final call, Kuala Lumpur to Beijing. The audio was muffled, warped, like it was underwater. I stepped back, my heart pounding. Every logical part of my brain screamed that it was some leftover system file. But then came another sound, a suitcase rolling. Not loud, just the wheels tapping gently on the tile floor behind me. I turned my flashlight around, but the corridor was empty. The sound continued, slow and steady, until it stopped a few feet away. I couldn't see anything. Then the automatic boarding gate light flickered on. The panel flashed, scanning, like it used to when passengers boarded. The air felt colder around me now, almost freezing. I heard what sounded like footsteps shuffling near the line markers, soft but many, like people moving in slow motion. I told myself it was wind. Maybe the air system had kicked on somehow, but the gate hadn't had ventilation for years. The speakers hissed again, followed by a faint chorus of overlapping whispers. None of it made sense. Too fast, too distorted. But I could make out bits of phrases. Flight on time, boarding complete, thank you for flying, and then silence, total, absolute silence. I didn't realize I was backing up until my heel hit one of the seats. The flashlight flickered again, dimming just enough for me to see something at the end of the jet bridge door. A shape, just an outline against the frosted glass. It looked human, but not right. Too still. shoulders slumped, head tilted to one side. I called out, asking if someone was there. No answer. The shape didn't move. The air felt charged, static crawling across my skin. When I took a step closer, the emergency lights above the jet bridge flickered once, and the shape was gone. I rushed to the glass, shined the flashlight through, but there was nothing. Just the empty tunnel leading out to where the plane would have been, years ago. The gate indicator on the desk blinked once more before going dark completely. I logged the incident as power surge. It was the easiest way to explain what I couldn't understand. My supervisor didn't question it, though he raised an eyebrow when he saw how pale I looked. I didn't mention the voice, or the footsteps, or that figure. Weeks passed, and I avoided that corridor as much as I could. But once you've seen something like that, the airport doesn't sound the same. Every echo, every rolling suitcase in the distance felt like it came from somewhere it shouldn't. The strangest part came later, during a system update. The IT team was cleaning old data logs, and one of the technicians called me over, joking that the terminal servers still thought Flight 370 was active. He said it had been pinging the system every few months, always from the same local network node, Gate 17. I laughed it off, but something inside me went cold. They wiped the files, reset the system, and the readings stopped. Still, I can't shake what I saw that night. I've gone over every possibility. Maybe a short circuit reconnected the monitor. Maybe I imagined the footsteps because I expected to hear them. Maybe, but sometimes when the fog rolls over the tarmac just right and the motion sensors glitch, I swear I can see the faint green light of that gate come alive again. And if I stand still enough, I can almost hear the soft echo of a boarding announcement drifting down the corridor, like the airport itself never accepted that the plane was gone. Story 2. Airports always remind me of arteries, bright, endless tunnels pulsing with people instead of blood. I've been a flight engineer for most of my adult life, and I've seen just about everything a cockpit can throw at you. Mechanical failures, lightning strikes, birds in engines. You name it. But the one thing I still can't explain happened about 12 years ago, during my time with an airline that had once operated a fleet of old L-1011 TriStars. The company had a few of those planes left in service. They were aging birds, sturdy but worn down from decades of patchwork repairs. One of them, tail number N318EA, always made me uneasy, and I never knew exactly why. It wasn't the plane's looks. On the surface, it was fine, but every time I boarded it for maintenance checks, something about the cabin felt off. Too quiet, even when the hangar was filled with noise. Like sound itself avoided that fuselage. Back then, I didn't know much about the plane's history. All I knew was that it had some recycled components salvaged from another L1011 that had gone down in Florida back in the 70s. The parts had been inspected and certified long before my time, but there was always gossip among the mechanics. Old-timers saying the original aircraft had been cursed. They used to whisper about Eastern Flight 401, about how its pilots got distracted over a burned-out bulb and never realized the autopilot had disconnected. The plane went down in the Everglades, killing more than half the people on board. The rumors said pieces of that wreck were used in other jets, and strange things started happening afterward. I never paid much attention. Pilots are a superstitious bunch. They tell ghost stories the same way sailors do, to fill silence during long shifts. It was a night flight to Dallas when things started. The captain had called in sick last minute, so I was paired with a newer pilot, quiet but competent. I remember we took off just after midnight, and within an hour we were cruising smooth. The autopilot held steady, instruments were perfect, and the sky was clear enough to see stars blinking over the wing. Sometime after the meal service, I went to the galley for coffee. The flight attendants were chatting softly at the back, their voices carrying through the narrow space. That's when one of them asked me if the captain had gone to rest early. I told her no, the captain was still in the cockpit. She frowned. She said she'd just seen a man in uniform walking down the aisle toward the rear lavatory. I brushed it off, said she probably saw a passenger wearing something similar, but she looked certain, said she saw the captain's stripes on the shoulders. When I went back to the flight deck, the pilot was still there, focused on the instruments. We were the only two up front. I told him what she said, and he gave a small laugh. said maybe she'd been awake too long. Neither of us thought much of it after that. About 40 minutes later, the cockpit temperature dropped. At first, I thought it was the ventilation. Sometimes those old air systems pushed out cold bursts when the recirculation valves acted up. I reached up to check the overhead panel, but everything was normal. Then came the faint sound of breathing. Not loud, just the soft rhythm of someone exhaling slowly behind us. The kind of sound you hear when a person leans over your shoulder. I turned around instinctively, but there was no one there. Only the empty jump seat against the rear bulkhead. I stared at it for a few seconds, feeling ridiculous. The light from the overhead instruments made the seat look faintly metallic, catching reflections from the altimeter. I was about to turn back when I noticed something. An impression on the cushion, like someone had just been sitting there. I blinked, leaned closer, but the mark faded almost as soon as I looked at it. The rest of the flight went smoothly, but the feeling never left. Even the hum of the engines felt different, slower, heavier, like the plane was carrying more weight than what the manifest said. When we landed in Dallas, I stayed behind to help run a systems check before disembarking. The pilot had already left for the hotel shuttle, so I was alone. The cabin lights flickered slightly as I walked back through the aisle. Every seat was empty, tray tables up, curtains drawn between sections. As I reached the rear galley, a faint metallic click echoed through the fuselage. I stopped listening. It came again, from somewhere near the forward section, like a latch being flipped. I started walking back, more out of habit than bravery, and that's when I saw it. Just past the middle exit row, one of the jump seats was down. That wasn't unusual by itself. Flight attendants sometimes left them like that. But what made me stop was the reflection in the small mirror beside it. A figure was seated there. The shape was too solid to be a trick of the light. A man in a dark uniform, head bowed slightly as if reviewing a checklist. My first thought was that someone had snuck on board, maybe a maintenance worker I didn't see. But as I turned toward the seat itself, it was empty. No one there. The air felt heavier then, and the faint scent of burned wiring hung in the cabin, the same smell you get when a circuit short circuits. I ran a full sweep after that, opened every lavatory door, checked every compartment, nothing. I told no one about it that night. I didn't even tell the maintenance crew. I just logged the systems check as complete and left. A week later, I mentioned it casually to one of the senior engineers over lunch. He gave me a strange look and asked which plane it was. When I told him, his face went pale. He said that particular aircraft had once carried components from Flight 401, the very one that went down in the Everglades. He even joked that I'd probably met Captain Loft himself, one of the original pilots who'd died in that crash. I laughed it off, of course, but that night, curiosity got the better of me. I looked up old records, photos, anything about Flight 401. When I found the cockpit crew's pictures, my stomach dropped. The man I'd seen in that reflection, the slumped posture, the uniform, it was almost identical to the captain's photo. I've tried to explain it logically. Maybe exhaustion played tricks on my eyes. Maybe the reflection was my own, distorted by low cabin lighting. I even thought about light refraction through the curved windows. But none of those explanations sit right when I remember how the seat cushion looked depressed before fading back to normal. That aircraft was decommissioned a few years later, and I heard it was stripped for parts again. Sometimes I wonder if those pieces ended up in other planes, scattered across different fleets. And if they did, if the captain's ghost really lingered with his machine, then maybe someone else right now is seeing what I saw. Every time I fly at night and hear the soft hum of the engines, I still half expect to catch that faint scent of burned wiring or hear slow breathing behind me. I tell myself it's just the cabin pressure or the systems recalibrating, but deep down there's a part of me that thinks maybe, just maybe, some flights never really end. Story 3. There's something unnerving about the sky when it's too quiet. It's like standing in a church after everyone's gone, surrounded by the echo of something that isn't there anymore. I'd been an air traffic controller for almost 8 years by the summer of 2005, stationed at Athens International. You get used to the rhythm of things in that job, the rise and fall of voices, the constant beeps, the soft hum of radar screens. Planes move like clockwork, each one following its invisible path. But that morning something went wrong, and I've never been able to shake it off since. The Helios flight from Larnaca to Athens, Flight 522, checked in as usual. Routine. Weather was clear, sky visibility perfect. I remember sipping lukewarm coffee as the transponder blinked on my screen. It climbed steadily, reporting altitude changes like every other day. Then not long after, one of the technicians radioed that the crew had reported air conditioning issues before departure. "Nothing major," he'd said, "just a note in the logbook." Still, it stuck in the back of my mind. When the aircraft crossed into Greek airspace, I tried to reach them for the standard handover. No response. That wasn't uncommon. Sometimes pilots were busy, sometimes frequency interference kicked in, but after multiple tries, still nothing. I remember feeling my chest tighten a bit, the way it does when your instincts start whispering that something isn't right. The plane continued its path perfectly, altitude steady, speed unchanged. It looked normal in every measurable way, except for the silence. About 20 minutes in, another controller beside me mentioned that the plane hadn't acknowledged its altitude clearance either. That was the first real red flag. I tried again, more firmly this time, identifying the flight by number and requesting confirmation. Again, nothing. I could see its path, clear as day, holding altitude at 34,000 feet. It wasn't descending, wasn't deviating, wasn't showing any signs of trouble, except that it might as well have been flying itself. Protocol kicked in. We scrambled to contact the Hellenic Air Force to intercept, thinking it might be a comms failure or hijack situation. Even then, the room didn't feel panicked, just focused. Everyone doing what they were trained to do. But beneath that calm, there was this strange tension in the air, like the pressure before a storm. While we waited for the fighter jets to reach visual range, I stared at the radar return. I couldn't help imagining the inside of that cabin, rows of passengers, probably unaware anything was wrong, the flight attendants moving calmly down the aisle, maybe even the smell of reheated coffee drifting through recycled air. I told myself that's what was happening. It had to be. When the Air Force finally reached visual contact, we leaned into the live radio feed from their pilots. Their tone shifted halfway through the first report. They said they could see the aircraft clearly. No damage, no smoke trails, nothing to indicate distress. But when they approached the cockpit, they described seeing the captain slumped forward, face against the controls, unmoving. The co-pilot too, just there, motionless. That was the moment something in the room changed. You could feel it ripple through every person. We've all dealt with emergencies, but this was different, because everything about that plane set a live instrument steady, altitude perfect, engine power constant. It was like watching a heartbeat on a monitor when you already know the patient is gone. The fighter pilot circled back, trying to make eye contact through the cockpit window. He said at one point he thought he saw movement behind the pilot's seat, a figure stepping into view. He couldn't identify who it was. The figure leaned toward the controls but didn't respond to his signals. Just stood there, then turned away. After that, the plane continued to fly, silent and obedient, for over an hour. Every once in a while, a warning tone from the autopilot system echoed faintly through the radio feed. It sounded eerie, like a distant alarm in a dream. Then, without warning, the engines began to fade. The plane started to drift, losing altitude gradually. The autopilot held on as long as it could, then the nose tilted slightly, and the radar return began to drop. I sat frozen, watching the line sink lower. It vanished from the screen near Grammatico. The impact registered seconds later. No survivors. The official report later said it was human error, a pressurization switch left in the wrong setting after maintenance. The cabin depressurized as they climbed, and everyone on board lost consciousness. The aircraft continued on autopilot until it ran out of fuel. Perfectly explainable, perfectly tragic. That's what the documents say. But there's something no report mentions, something I've never told anyone outside of work. About 10 minutes before the plane's engines finally died, the radio on our end crackled. Just once. Not the usual static, not interference. It was a faint sound, a low breath, like someone exhaling close to the mic. I thought maybe it was feedback from the fighter jets, but they reported nothing. Then, right before the connection cut completely, a voice, soft, distant, came through. Just 2 words. I couldn't make them out clearly, but they sounded like, "Still here." I've tried for years to explain it away. The rational side of me says it was radio bleed through, maybe a stray transmission bouncing off the mountains. That happens sometimes, but every time I replay it in my head, I remember how deliberate it sounded. Not static, not random, like someone realizing, too late, that they weren't supposed to be there anymore. Story 4. Airports have their own kind of silence at night. It's not peaceful silence, more like the quiet that follows a warning. The hum of distant turbines, the faint echo of luggage carts, the occasional burst of radio chatter. All of it blends into a low, uneasy heartbeat that never really stops. That's what I remember most from my time at 4 de Fevereiro International Airport in Angola. The silence between those sounds, like the place was holding its breath. I worked ground control there for a few years in the early 2000s. The job wasn't glamorous. Most of my shifts were long nights spent in a small concrete tower that smelled like old coffee and machine grease. I handled maintenance movements, fuel logs, and cargo checks. It wasn't the busiest airport, but there were enough private charters and cargo flights that things stayed unpredictable. One night, I was logging the last few scheduled takeoffs when something unusual caught my eye on the outer runway. Runway 25. A Boeing 727 sat parked there, one of those older tri-engine models that had been sitting for months. It belonged to an old American leasing company that went bankrupt, and the plane had been stranded after a payment dispute. People called it the Ghost Bird because it never moved, never left, and yet somehow never seemed abandoned either. Someone had been maintaining it just enough to keep it from decaying completely. Fuel checks, wheel rotations, things like that. That night, though, something was different. Around sunset, I noticed faint movement near it. From that distance, it looked like 2 figures climbing up through the service stairs. That wasn't normal. The plane wasn't scheduled for anything, and access required clearance. I radioed the field crew, but nobody responded. Maintenance shifts ended early that day due to a power outage in one of the hangars, so the tarmac should have been empty. I told myself it was just contractors finishing late work. Still, I kept watching. The figures moved around the cockpit area, their flashlights flickering inside the cabin. The sun dropped below the horizon, and soon the only light came from their torches and the faint glow from the control tower. About half an hour later, I noticed the navigation lights on the 727 blink once. Just once. They shouldn't have come on. The aircraft had no clearance, no active maintenance ticket, and the transponder wasn't registered on the radar grid. I called into the frequency used for ground-to-ground communication, expecting someone to answer. Silence. Then the engine started. You don't forget that sound. The old 727's Pratt & Whitney engines roared alive one by one, each one coughing and whining as they built up to a steady growl. The entire airfield seemed to shake. I remember standing up from my chair and staring through the glass in disbelief. There wasn't supposed to be enough fuel on board for startup, let alone flight. I grabbed the secondary line to contact the operations center, but before anyone answered, the plane's landing lights snapped on, flooding the tarmac in harsh white light. It began to roll forward, slow at first, then faster. I called for emergency response, shouting coordinates, but the tower chief cut me off midway and asked what I was talking about. The radar showed nothing. I repeated that the Boeing 727-25 was taxiing. He said there was no aircraft movement on any active runway. I swear to this day I could see it, clear as anything. The engines roared, the wings shuddered as it gained speed. It wasn't a hallucination. The ground crew nearest the hangars later admitted they heard it too but saw nothing. The lights, the vibration, the air pressure, they all felt it. The plane picked up speed, heading straight for takeoff. I stood frozen, my headset slipping off my ear as I watched the nose lift slightly. Then the runway lights flickered. Every one of them blinked out for less than a second, just long enough for the whole field to go dark. And when they came back on, the plane was gone. No sound, no light, no silhouette against the night sky. Just empty runway. I scanned the horizon, expecting to see taillights climbing upward, but there was nothing. The radar still showed a blank screen. The tower logs recorded no transponder signal, No takeoff clearance, no trace of departure. It was as if the plane had never been there. Security swept the area immediately. The maintenance stairs were gone. The wheel marks on the tarmac were fresh but ended abruptly halfway down the strip, like the aircraft had simply lifted off mid-run. No fuel leaks, no debris, no scorch marks. Just the faint smell of burnt kerosene in the air. By morning, the entire airport was in chaos. The Angolan aviation authorities contacted the U.S. Embassy, then the FAA, and later the FBI. The story hit international intelligence circuits like wildfire. A stolen Boeing 727 vanished into thin air. No radar, no flight plan, no wreckage. Over the next few weeks, I was interviewed multiple times. They asked the same questions again and again. Did I know the two men? Did I see where they went? Did I have any personal connection to the aircraft? My answers never changed. I didn't know them. I didn't even know for sure who they were. The only thing I was certain of was that the plane existed, and that I saw it move with my own eyes. The investigation dragged on for years. Reports came in from remote islands, desert regions, even parts of the Indian Ocean. None were confirmed. No one found a single piece of debris, no emergency beacons, no flight path, nothing. Sometimes at night, I think back to that sound, the engines starting up, echoing through the airfield. The tower chief later joked that maybe I heard a different plane from another airport, some strange echo. I almost believed him until I remembered something that still makes my skin crawl. 2 days after the incident, I was walking past the maintenance yard when I saw a fuel truck driver washing down his rig. He called me over and said something odd. He mentioned finding wet footprints on the back step of his truck that morning. Bare feet, not boots. He thought maybe someone was playing a prank, but when he tried to rinse them off, they didn't fade. They just stayed there, faint outlines pressed into the metal, until the next rainfall 2 days later. There was no mud on the tarmac that night. Years have passed, but I still sometimes catch myself checking radar feeds online, looking for reports of unregistered 727 sightings. Every now and then, someone posts something, a blurry photograph, a grainy video clip, a claim that a 3-engine jet flew low over the Atlantic without a transponder. I don't know what to believe anymore. Part of me still wonders if it was ever really stolen. Maybe it was something else, something that was never supposed to be seen. Because no matter how many official documents say otherwise, I can't shake the memory of that plane accelerating into darkness and vanishing between one heartbeat and the next, leaving only silence behind. And sometimes when I close my eyes, I can still hear it. The deep, rhythmic rumble of 3 engines, distant and fading, like thunder from a storm that never existed. Story 5. Airports always have their own rhythm. Even when nothing's moving, you can feel the place breathing. Engines cooling, lights humming, wind sweeping across the asphalt like a pulse. I'd been working ground operations at Savannah Hilton Head International for about 6 years when something happened that I still can't quite put into words. People always talk about the haunted stories tied to this place, but I never paid them any attention. To me, it was just another night shift under the sodium glow, making sure the runways were clear and the lights stayed on. It was early March, the kind of night where fog rolls in so thick it feels like you could scoop it up in your hands. The late flights had all cleared, and I was assigned to inspect the far end of runway 10. That section doesn't get much love. It's quieter, older, closer to the tree line. The air smells different out there too, damp and earthy, like the swamps trying to reclaim the land. The only light came from the edge lamps along the tarmac and the red beacons in the distance. I drove the small utility cart down the service lane, radio crackling in and out from interference. Static, then silence, then static again. It's normal around the perimeter fence, but still, it sets your teeth on edge when you're out there alone. I remember thinking it felt unusually quiet that night, even for an airport at midnight. About halfway down the runway, the fog got worse. My headlights turned it into a solid wall, so I slowed to a crawl. That's when I noticed 2 dark shapes ahead, low, square, and side by side, right near the center line. For a second, I thought it might have been debris or equipment left behind after maintenance. But when I pulled up closer and the light hit it just right, I realized what it was. 2 flat gravestones built directly into the tarmac. I'd heard people talk about them before, Richard and Catherine Dotson. Locals said their family farm used to be here before the land was bought for the airport. Supposedly, when the new runway was built, their descendants refused to move the graves. The compromise was this. They built the runway over the family plot and embedded the markers in the pavement. I'd seen photos before, but never up close. I parked the cart and stepped out, the sound of my boots sharp against the asphalt. The fog swallowed everything just beyond a few feet. Standing over the stones, I brushed away a layer of moisture. The names were faint but still legible, carved in worn marble that looked out of place surrounded by all that concrete and paint. For a moment I felt uneasy, not afraid exactly, just a weird kind of guilt. Like I'd walked into someone's living room without knocking. That's when I noticed the temperature had dropped. The night was already cool, but this was different. The air felt heavy and still, like the moment before a storm. My breath started fogging in front of me, and the tiny hairs on my arms rose under my jacket. I told myself it was just the wind funneling through the trees nearby, or maybe the fog settling colder on the ground. Still, I couldn't shake the sense that I wasn't alone anymore. I tried to focus on the inspection, check the edge lights, log the markers, and crouch to inspect one of the in-ground reflectors. That's when I heard it, a faint tapping sound behind me, slow, measured, not metal, not stone, more like the soft scrape of shoes against pavement. I turned, but the fog was so thick that the world ended about 10 feet in front of me. I called out, though my voice sounded small, swallowed by the mist. No answer. I figured it might be another crew member doing a perimeter check, but no lights, no engine hum, nothing to suggest a vehicle was nearby. The airport radio stayed dead silent. I told myself to stop overthinking it and got back to work, but the tapping started again, this time closer. I stood up fast, flashlight cutting through the haze, and that's when I saw them. Two figures, faint but clear enough to make out, standing near the center of the runway, both facing away from me, side by side. The first thing I noticed was how still they were. Not even the fog seemed to move around them. The second thing was that they didn't cast shadows. I took a few slow steps forward, thinking maybe it was just the beam playing tricks through the fog. But the closer I got, the clearer they became. One tall, one slightly shorter, like a man and woman. The air around me felt charged, like static before lightning. I could hear the low hum of the runway lights, but nothing else. Not even the sound of my own footsteps anymore. Then as I raised my light higher, they turned. Not fast, not dramatic, just slowly, as if curious about the sound behind them. For a split second, I saw their faces, pale, almost transparent, with the faintest shimmer like heat off asphalt. Their eyes didn't look at me exactly. They looked through me, past me, maybe at something that wasn't there anymore. And just as suddenly, they were gone. The fog folded in, and I was alone again. I stood there for a long moment, breathing hard. My flashlight flickered once, then steadied. My heart was hammering so hard it felt like it echoed in my ears. I don't even remember walking back to the cart. I just remember suddenly being in it, engine revving, heading back toward the terminal lights like a lifeline. When I got to the operations office, I tried to play it off. I told myself it was just fatigue, light refraction, the kind of tricks fog and nerves can play on a tired brain. But when I logged the inspection report, I noticed something that made me stop. Under remarks, I'd written, 2 pedestrians near 10C, unclear identification. I didn't remember writing it. I don't even remember pulling the pen from my pocket. The handwriting was mine though, shaky, uneven. I thought about erasing it, but something told me not to, so I left it. The next morning I went out with the day crew to double-check the section. The fog had cleared, and the sunlight made everything look normal again. The tarmac stretched out smooth and clean, and the gravestones were just there, ordinary, flat and quiet. I mentioned the figures casually, pretending it was a joke, and one of the older guys just nodded. He didn't make a big deal out of it. Just said some things at that airport never really left when the land changed hands. I've been back to that runway plenty of times since then, always during daylight, always with company. And every now and then, especially when the sun drops low and the fog starts rolling in, I catch myself looking down the tarmac, half expecting to see them again. Maybe it's just a trick of the light. Maybe it's the human brain trying to find meaning in the mist. But every time I drive past those stones, I can't help thinking, if I'd stayed a few seconds longer that night, maybe they would have had something to say. Story 6. Airports have their own kind of heartbeat. You can feel it if you stand still long enough. The low hum of engines, the constant shuffle of people coming and going, the buzz of announcements that blend into white noise. I'd worked security at Honolulu International for almost 9 years, and after a while, the rhythm of the place became second nature. But there was one part of the airport where that pulse felt wrong, like a skipped beat in a song you knew by heart. Gate 14 in the older terminal. I didn't think much of it when I started. Every airport has its odd corners, but Gate 14 had this quiet that didn't match the rest of the building. Even when flights were scheduled there, people seemed uneasy, like they were subconsciously trying to sit closer to the windows or near other travelers. Some of the old-timers used to joke that the gate had bad luck. Flights out of there were delayed more often than others. Power glitches, random equipment failures, lost luggage, stuff that could all be explained, until it started happening too consistently. My first real shift alone covering that gate was on a Wednesday night about 3 years ago. I remember it because it was one of those heavy nights, humid air, the kind that made the fluorescent lights flicker faintly. The last flight for the night had already departed, and I was stationed there until the cleaning crew finished. The terminal was practically empty, except for the faint sound of mops on tile and the occasional rolling suitcase echoing down the corridor. I did a few slow laps, checked the exits, then settled near the window overlooking the runway. The city lights shimmered in the distance, and for a while, it was peaceful in that eerie kind of way only airports can be after midnight. Then I noticed her. At first, I thought it was just another late passenger. A woman stood by the large glass panel facing the tarmac, her reflection caught in the faint light. She wore a white dress that looked dated, like something out of the 70s, long hair down her back. She wasn't doing anything, just standing there looking out toward the dark runway. I called out to her, standard procedure, asking if she needed help or missed her flight. No response. She didn't even flinch. I figured maybe she was wearing earbuds, so I stepped closer. Still nothing. When I got within a few feet, I caught a better glimpse of her face reflected in the glass, and something about it was off. The reflection was clearer than it should have been, like the lighting was hitting her from the wrong direction. Her skin looked pale, almost gray under the fluorescent lights, and her expression was empty. Completely blank, except for her eyes, which looked sad, in a way that makes you feel it in your chest. Before I could say anything else, a loud crack came from behind me, the sound of a chair tipping over near the gate desk. I turned instinctively, flashlight out, scanning the area. Nothing. When I turned back, the woman was gone. Just gone. The weird part? There was only one hallway leading away from that window, and I'd been blocking it. She couldn't have gone anywhere without passing me. I walked to the glass and looked outside. No one. The tarmac was empty except for one parked maintenance truck about 100 yards away. I radioed it in, told the shift supervisor that someone might have wandered past security somehow. They told me to recheck the surrounding gates. I spent the next half hour combing through the area, checking restrooms, service doors, even the locked lounge space. Nothing. No sign of her. I laughed it off at the time. I mean, every airport has ghost stories. But that night, when I clocked out and started walking back through the terminal toward the parking lot, I passed one of the big glass doors that looked out toward the runways again, and there she was. Same dress, same stillness, same spot. Except I was at least 2 gates away from where I'd seen her before. This time, she wasn't facing the runway. She was turned toward the terminal, facing me. I stopped walking. My brain went through the usual rational checklist: reflection, glare, fatigue, optical illusion. But she was standing outside, on the tarmac. There's no way that could have been real. No one can get out there without clearance. I blinked once, twice, and she was gone again. After that, I didn't mention it to anyone. What was I supposed to say? That I saw a ghost staring back at me through airport glass? Maintenance guys said their tools would go missing and show up later at the window, and always at gate 14. A few weeks later, I checked the security feed out of curiosity. I pulled the footage from that night. The timestamp matched exactly when I'd seen her. I watched the video, my stomach tightening as the camera panned across the empty gate area. There was no one there. But right before I turned toward the noise, the moment before I flinched, you could see something strange on the glass, a faint smudge, shaped almost like a person's silhouette. When I zoomed in, the image pixelated, but the outline was unmistakable. A woman's figure, faint but clear enough that you could see the shape of her head tilted toward the window, like she was waiting for something just beyond the glass. I didn't report it. I deleted the clip. Part of me didn't want to fuel the rumors. Part of me didn't want to know more. Since then, I've worked dozens of night shifts at the airport. I've gotten used to the weird sounds, the flickering lights, even the cold drafts that sweep through when the air conditioning's supposedly off. But now and then, when I'm walking past the old terminal, I catch a glimpse of movement near Gate 14. Story 7. Airports are like veins. You can feel the life pulsing through them even at 2 a.m. when the world outside is asleep. I worked nights at Denver International for 5 years as part of the maintenance crew, and I swear that place has a heartbeat of its own. You can hear it in the echo of your boots down the service tunnels, in the low hum of machinery buried deep under the tarmac. It's not the kind of noise that ever really stops. It just breathes. Most people only see the pretty side, the white peaks that look like snow caps, the art installations that make no sense, and that big blue horse statue outside that everyone calls Lucifer. But behind the walls under the runways is a whole different world. There's an entire network of tunnels and maintenance corridors that stretch for miles. Some connect to baggage handling. Others go deeper, to places that aren't even marked on the blueprints we were given. I remember the first time I heard the rumor. One of the older guys, Hank, told me that during construction in the 90s, there were tunnels that had to be sealed off because workers kept getting lost down there. He said that the GPS signals wouldn't work underground, and compasses spun like crazy. Of course, everyone laughed it off. Construction workers talk. They like to make things sound mysterious. Still, I couldn't help but notice that certain doors in the lowest levels always stayed locked, even from our side. One winter night, I was assigned to check a faulty ventilation system below Concourse C. It was almost midnight. Snow was coming down hard outside, and most flights had already been grounded. The tunnels were quiet, just that hum in the background and the sound of my cartwheels squeaking on the concrete floor. I had a map of the maintenance routes, but the section I needed wasn't labeled clearly. There was just a square space marked utility access, with no specific number. When I reached the last intersection, I realized I'd gone farther than usual. The concrete walls started to change. Old sections, rougher texture, painted over at least a dozen times. There were signs in faded red paint, half scratched off, with letters I couldn't make out. For a moment, I thought maybe I'd wandered into one of those sealed-off areas Hank talked about. My flashlight beam caught a trail of footprints in the dust ahead. Fresh ones. I wasn't the only one down there. I called it in over my radio, but all I got was static, not even a buzz. I thought maybe I was too deep underground. The walls in that part of the airport were thick, and signal interference was normal. Still, the silence on the line made my stomach twist. I followed the prints until they stopped at a heavy steel door. No label, no handle, just a keyhole. It was painted the same color as the wall, like someone wanted it to disappear. I shouldn't have, but curiosity got the better of me. I tried one of the skeleton keys we use for general access, and to my surprise, it turned. Inside was a narrow passage that sloped downward, colder than the tunnels above. The air smelled damp, metallic. My breath came out white. The deeper I went, the quieter it got, like the sound was being swallowed whole. The concrete floor turned to rough stone, uneven under my boots. My flashlight flickered, and for a moment I thought I saw movement. Something like a figure standing at the end of the hall, just outside the beam's reach. I froze. My heart thudded so loud it drowned everything else out. The figure didn't move closer. It just stood there. I blinked, and when the light steadied, it was gone. I told myself it was just a trick of shadows, tired eyes playing games. But I wasn't tired. Not like that. I turned to leave, but something had changed. The tunnel behind me didn't look the same. The walls seemed narrower, darker, almost like they were pulsing slightly. My flashlight flickered again, and I felt something brush past my shoulder, a cold rush of air, sharp enough to raise every hair on my arm. I started walking faster, then faster still, until I was practically jogging. The sound of my boots echoed wrong, offbeat, like another set of footsteps joined in, just half a step behind. When I finally reached the door, I slammed it shut and locked it. My chest was heaving, and I could barely get a signal on my radio. After a few tries, someone finally responded. A guy from the security office. He said my ID tracker had glitched, showing I was outside the airport perimeter for several minutes, even though I'd never left the building. I went straight to the break room and sat there for a good half hour, trying to calm down. Hank walked in later and joked that I looked like I'd seen one of the lizard people. I didn't laugh. I told him about the tunnel, the door, the cold air. He stared at me for a long time before saying he'd heard stories about the old facility. According to him, before the current airport was finished, there'd been another structure planned underneath. Something military. They'd scrapped it and built over it instead. Supposedly. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure again. Just a shape at the end of a dark hall. I kept telling myself it was an optical illusion, but then small things started happening after that. Tools would disappear from my cart and reappear somewhere else. My flashlight would drain halfway through a shift, no matter how new the batteries were. One morning I found a smear of reddish dust on my uniform sleeve, the kind that came from the older stone walls, but I hadn't gone near them again. I even got checked for exposure to mold or gases, thinking maybe something down there had messed with my head. Everything came back normal. The strangest part? A few weeks after my incident, that section of the tunnel got sealed off completely. When I asked why, nobody had an answer. One of the managers said there were structural concerns. But when I checked the maintenance logs, there was no record of inspection, no request, nothing. It was just closed, permanently. I still work at the airport, but I never go near that wing anymore. Sometimes when I'm driving the service vehicle across the tarmac late at night, I glance toward the area above where that tunnel would have been. There's a faint hum you can hear from the ground, a vibration under the concrete that doesn't match any of the systems we know. Maybe it's the generators. Maybe it's the air pressure from miles of vents and machinery buried below. But some nights when everything else is quiet, it sounds less like a hum and more like breathing. And I can't help but think about those sealed tunnels, about what might still be waiting down there, underneath all that glass and steel and noise. Because for a place that's supposed to move millions of people every year, Denver International sure has a lot of space no one's supposed to find. Story 8. Airports have a strange kind of silence hidden underneath all the noise. It's not the quiet of emptiness, but the pause between departures, the breath the world takes before people scatter across time zones. I'd been in enough airports to notice it, but Suvarnabhumi felt different, like the silence was waiting for you to listen to something you shouldn't. I was flying back to London after a 2-week trip in Thailand. My flight was delayed overnight, so I got stuck with a hotel voucher and a boarding pass for an early morning departure. I didn't mind. I'd been through Bangkok's airport before. It's sleek, enormous, full of glass and steel, but there's a weird undercurrent you can't quite put your finger on. People always said it was built on a swamp, and some claimed it was cursed ground. I never paid attention to those things. I figured that sort of talk came from superstition. That night, the airport felt emptier than I'd ever seen it. The loudspeaker announcements were gone, and the only sound was the hum of the moving walkways. Most of the shops had their shutters half down. I decided to wander a bit instead of heading straight to the transit hotel. Maybe stretch my legs, find a quiet place to read before I crashed. Around midnight, I ended up near one of the older concourses. The lighting there was dimmer, almost yellowish, and I remember thinking it looked unfinished, like part of the airport no one really used anymore. My gate, a 6, was supposedly down that hall. The digital signboard showed it clearly, so I followed. But as I got closer, something felt off. The air was colder than the rest of the terminal, like the air conditioning was turned up too high. And though I could see the reflections of cleaning staff in the glass walls behind me, when I turned around, no one was there. Just my own reflection, except for a split second, it didn't quite look like me. I blamed the flickering light above the travelator and kept walking. The corridor seemed to stretch further than it should have. You know when you walk in one direction and the end never seems to get closer? It was that kind of feeling. I kept expecting to see other passengers or staff, but there was no one. Just rows of empty chairs and silent gates. Then I noticed the numbering, a 3, a 4, a 5, and then a 7. No A6. I stopped, thinking maybe I'd missed it. I turned around, scanning the signs again. Same thing, no gate 6 anywhere. I pulled out my phone to double-check my boarding pass. Gate A6, clear as day. The airport Wi-Fi wasn't connecting though, and my data was dead. I figured maybe the gate had been reassigned, but something about the corridor made me uneasy. That's when I heard footsteps, slow ones. Not from behind me, but from up ahead, near where the corridor curved out of sight. I thought maybe a staff member was coming, so I called out to ask if A6 was down that way. No answer. The footsteps kept going, echoing off the tiles. I stepped closer, half expecting to see someone in uniform. But when I rounded the bend, the hallway was empty, except for one open doorway on the right. The sign above it said A6. The gate shouldn't have been there. I'd walked the same corridor 10 minutes ago, and that door hadn't existed. Yet there it was, lit from inside, faintly orange instead of the cold white light the rest of the terminal used. I tried to convince myself it was some kind of maintenance area, maybe mislabeled. Still, something about the quiet hum inside drew me closer. The glass panels on the door were slightly fogged. I could make out rows of seats inside, but they looked different, older, almost retro. I hesitated, then pushed the door open. A gust of warm, stale air hit me immediately. The smell was wrong, not awful, just strange, like burnt dust mixed with something metallic. Inside, everything looked off. The chairs were arranged the same way as in any gate, but the upholstery was faded, like it had been there for decades. The TV monitor above the boarding desk flickered with static. I stepped in slowly, telling myself it was probably a closed-off section that hadn't been renovated yet. Then I noticed something else. My reflection in the glass wall opposite me wasn't moving right. It lagged, just by a fraction of a second, but enough to make my stomach turn. When I raised my hand to rub my eye, my reflection followed a beat too late. I stepped closer to the glass, staring at it. The outline looked like me, same clothes, same face, but the eyes seemed darker, deeper. I blinked hard and turned around, ready to get out of there. That's when I heard it again. Footsteps, this time behind me. I spun around, expecting to see someone. Nothing. Just the empty gate. The door I'd come through was closed now, though I hadn't touched it. My phone buzzed suddenly, vibrating in my hand. The screen flickered on, showing no service, but the clock was wrong. It showed 3:17 a.m. I'd only been there maybe 15 minutes. I checked my watch. It said 12:42 a.m. The hairs on my arm stood straight up. Then the static on the monitor above the counter changed. It wasn't random fuzz anymore. It looked like moving figures, silhouettes walking across a runway. Planes in the background, people waving, but the image was distorted, grainy, like old film. The sound from the speakers crackled faintly, a low murmur I couldn't make out. I remember backing up, trying to reach the door. I grabbed the handle and yanked it open, stumbling into the hallway again. The air outside was freezing. When I turned back, the sign above the door didn't say a 6 anymore. It said maintenance access, authorized personnel only. I stood there for a minute, heart pounding, trying to make sense of it. I thought maybe I'd wandered into some closed-off zone or accidentally stumbled into a restricted area. That had to be it. I forced myself to walk back toward the main concourse, passing the same empty seats and silent shops. When I finally reached the information counter, a security guard was there. I showed him my boarding pass and asked where Gate A6 was. He looked at it for a moment, then said that A6 had been closed off years ago after a section of the terminal was remodeled. I told him I'd just come from there, and he frowned, said that wasn't possible because the door had been sealed. I didn't argue. I just asked for directions to the transit hotel and left. I barely slept that night, and when I boarded my flight the next morning, I tried not to think about it. But as the plane taxied, I glanced out the window at the terminal buildings. For a split second, near the far corner of Concourse A, I saw what looked like an old glass gate with a faint orange glow inside. And sitting near the window facing the runway was someone wearing the same clothes I'd had on the night before. I blinked and it was gone. To this day, I don't know what that section of the airport was or what I walked into. Maybe it was a construction zone I wasn't supposed to find. Maybe my brain filled in gaps in the low light. Or maybe some parts of that place still belonged to whatever was buried there before the airport existed. All I know is that my boarding pass still says Gate A6, and that gate doesn't exist anymore. Story 9. The hum of engines through glass, the chatter of distant radios, the echo of footsteps on linoleum at 3 a.m. I used to joke that I could tell how busy a night was just by the rhythm of the noise. That night, though, the rhythm broke. Everything stopped for a moment, like the building itself forgot how to breathe. I was working a late shift at the control tower of a mid-sized international airport. The weather was clear, the skies were calm, and most of the overnight flights had already departed. Usually, this time of night was peaceful, just cargo planes and the occasional red-eye. I remember sipping bad coffee, going through the motion of checking radar, logs, and comms when something odd happened. The first sign was a blip on the radar screen. At first, I thought it was a glitch. The transponder code was outdated, the kind used decades ago. It wasn't broadcasting the usual digital ID, just a 4-digit analog squawk that didn't make sense. I checked the list. No aircraft scheduled in that corridor. Then it began descending. I radioed the supposed aircraft to identify itself. No answer. The blip held steady, then slowed, aligning perfectly with one of our inactive runways. That caught my attention. Planes don't just drop out of nowhere like that, especially not on closed runways. For a few seconds, I assumed it was a training exercise or a misfiled flight. Maybe someone from the military running tests. But as I cross-checked flight logs, nothing matched. No flight plan, no record, no contact from the FAA or military. Just an old transponder code that didn't belong in modern aviation. Then my radio crackled. It was faint, like a whisper pushed through static. The voice was calm, formal, using air traffic phrasing from the 1950s. They identified themselves as Pan American Flight 914. The message was brief, saying they were coming in from New York, bound for Miami, requesting permission to land due to navigation issues. I froze. That flight number didn't exist anymore. Pan Am hadn't existed in decades. Still, procedure kicked in. I cleared the runway and guided them down, my hands shaking slightly on the mic. I half expected the radar to drop or fade, but it didn't. The aircraft stayed steady, descending smoothly until the tower cameras caught something. An old 4-engine propeller plane, the kind that hadn't flown commercially since the early 60s. It touched down like any other landing, wheels screeching softly against the tarmac, then began taxiing toward the main terminal. But there was a problem. There were no ground crew waiting, no lights guiding it, and no one else on the frequency seemed to notice what was happening. I switched to the ground channel, asking if anyone could see the plane. No response. I could see it clearly on the camera feed, though. Pan Am colors, blue stripe along the fuselage, windows glowing faintly yellow. Then the cameras blinked, just once. And when the feed returned, the plane was gone. The radar still showed it sitting there, but visually, the runway was empty. Not a single sign of movement. My first thought was that the feed had glitched or maybe been desynced with the radar, but the timestamps matched. I blinked at the monitor, then checked the physical runway through the tower binoculars. Nothing. Just asphalt and silence. I replayed the footage. The plane rolled to a stop, and then simply wasn't there in the next frame. No fade out, no motion blur. 1 second it existed, the next it didn't. I called security thinking maybe it had taxied off camera or something. A few minutes later, the ground patrol confirmed the runway was empty. No lights, no sound, no sign of disturbance. The odd part? The tarmac near the end of the strip looked disturbed, like fresh skid marks had been made. And right near the edge of the runway lights, one of the older ground crew later said he smelled something strange. Burnt oil mixed with a metallic tang, like ozone after lightning. I stayed late writing my report. It took me hours to explain what I'd seen without sounding insane. I listed it as a possible radar echo or instrument malfunction, though I didn't believe it. Before leaving, I double-checked the system for the transponder code again, thinking maybe I misread it. I didn't. The code wasn't assigned to any current aircraft. It matched a registration number for a Pan Am DC-4, Flight 914, that had vanished en route to Miami in 1955. The next day, I brought it up to a colleague who'd been in the tower with me that night. He looked confused when I mentioned it, said he didn't recall any radar anomaly, and the system logs didn't show an unscheduled landing. I thought he was joking, so I pulled up the playback files. They were gone. Deleted. Even the camera recordings from that hour were missing. The timestamp jumped from 2:14 a.m. to 3:01 a.m. No footage in between. When I reported the missing data to IT, they said there hadn't been any outages or technical issues. Everything else recorded fine. It was just that one time frame that didn't exist anymore. For days, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I even went down to the runway myself one night, standing near where the skid marks had been. The maintenance crew had already cleaned the area, but I could still make out faint tire impressions if I crouched close enough. And as I stood there in the dark, listening to the hum of distant generators, I swore I heard the faintest sound of propellers in the distance. Slow, rhythmic, fading as if pulling away. I know how that sounds. I've gone over it in my head 100 times. Every logical explanation I can think of falls apart somewhere. A weather balloon doesn't land. A glitch doesn't leave tire marks. And no amount of tired imagination can fabricate radio frequencies that old. What unsettles me the most, though, isn't the incident itself. It's what came after. About a week later, a small envelope appeared in my office inbox. No return address. Inside was a single yellowed flight manifest listing passengers aboard Pan Am, Flight 914. 57 names. At the bottom, in faded typewriter ink, was a note that read, "Arrive safely. Caracas, 1992. I showed it to my supervisor, but when I went back to get it from my desk later, it was gone. My drawer was empty. I still have a copy of the radar printout, though, the one showing the old transponder code and the path of descent. When I look at it, I can't shake the feeling that somewhere that plane's still flying. Story 10. Airports have their own kind of silence. It's not the peaceful kind. It's the type that hums beneath the surface, like the world's holding its breath between takeoffs and landings. I used to work ground maintenance at Andersen Air Force Base in Guam, and that hum was something I got used to. Every engine roar, every flashing light, every lonely cart moving across the runway at night, it all became background noise. Until one night, it didn't. Until one night, that silence turned heavy and wrong. It's been years, but I still remember it like it happened yesterday. March 16th, 1962. I was only 26, working the late shift. The humid air made everything feel slower, thicker. We were prepping for the refueling of Flying Tiger Line Flight 739, a Lockheed Constellation carrying troops heading toward Vietnam. Nothing about the flight stood out. Charter run, civilian contract, a bunch of young soldiers joking around near the hangar, their bags slung low, a few smoking even though they weren't supposed to. Typical. But as we started loading supplies, one of the crew mentioned their communications had been spotty on the previous leg. They said the radios had picked up faint chatter on unused frequencies, voices that didn't match any known call signs. The pilot brushed it off, saying it was probably some civilian station bleeding through. It wasn't the first time that kind of thing happened, so no one made a big deal out of it. When the plane taxied out, I stayed near the edge of the tarmac, watching its lights disappear into the night sky. The Lockheed's 4 engines rumbled deep enough to shake the ground under my boots. I remember thinking it was a beautiful sound, strong, confident. That was the last time anyone saw or heard that plane. A few hours later, the control tower started reporting radio silence. No response from Flight 739. They tried again and again. Static. They widened the frequency range. Still nothing. At first, everyone assumed they'd lost temporary contact. It happened before, especially over the Pacific. But when the flight failed to check in at the next waypoint, things got serious fast. Search and rescue scrambled at first light. The Coast Guard, the Navy, even some commercial pilots helped scan the ocean. They covered more than 100,000 square miles over several days. Nothing. No debris, no oil slick, no life vests, nothing. It was like the plane had been plucked right out of the sky. That should have been the end of it. A tragedy, sure, but one that could be explained. Mechanical failure, navigational error, whatever. Planes go down. The ocean hides everything. But then, 2 days after the disappearance, I was back on shift when the weirdest thing happened. It was close to midnight, and I was alone near Hangar 4 doing inventory on spare parts. The place was empty except for me, the echo of my clipboard tapping against a metal crate, and the low buzz of fluorescent lights. I was halfway through counting when I heard something. Radio chatter. Not from the main communications channel, but from one of the old handheld transceivers sitting on a shelf. The damn thing wasn't even powered on. At first I thought it was feedback or a stray frequency bouncing through the wiring, but then the voices became clearer, faint, distorted. They sounded like they were underwater. I caught fragments, numbers, maybe coordinates, and what I swear were the words "no horizon" and "still climbing." I went over, picked up the radio and checked the dial. It was off, completely off. The moment my hand touched it, the sound cut out. Dead silence. I checked the batteries, the switch, even the wiring behind the rack. Everything looked normal. I tried laughing it off, but I couldn't shake the unease crawling up my spine. A few nights later, it happened again, this time outside near the fueling station. I was restocking when the airbase lights flickered, just for a second. The generators didn't drop, just a quick pulse, like something passed through the grid. A cold gust followed, even though the air had been still moments before. Then came the sound, distant, faint, but unmistakable. The droning of 4 engines, the kind the old constellations had. I remember looking up instinctively, searching the night sky. Nothing there, but the sound grew louder. It circled the base once, twice before fading off toward the open ocean. I wasn't the only one who heard it. One of the tower operators came down later, pale as a sheet, saying they'd picked up a radar blip for about 30 seconds. A slow-moving aircraft, low altitude, no identification. When they tried to hail it, static filled the channel and the blip vanished. After that, rumors started flying around the base. Some said the plane had been shot down and covered up. Others whispered about time distortions or lost flight corridors over the Pacific where radio signals bent and compasses spun. I didn't buy any of that, but I couldn't explain the things I saw or heard. About a week later, I was doing another late inspection when the strangest thing happened. The airstrip lights were dim for maintenance, so most of the base was dark except for the glow from the hangars. As I walked past the perimeter fence, I noticed something odd. A faint light out over the water. Not a ship's light, not blinking like aircraft beacons do. It just hovered there, low on the horizon. I watched it for a while, assuming it was a fishing vessel or maybe a reflection. But then it started moving. Fast. Too fast. It streaked upward in total silence, then vanished behind the clouds. A moment later, I heard that same low rumble again. The exact sound of the constellation's engines, distant and fading. The next morning, a few of us went to check the shoreline where the light had been. Nothing. Just black sand and driftwood. But one of the guys pointed out something strange. Fresh boot prints leading from the waterline toward the brush. The pattern matched military-issue boots. We followed them for maybe 50 yards before they stopped. Dead in the middle of the sand, no sign of turning around, no drag marks, nothing. Just ended. No one ever mentioned it officially. The paperwork from the investigation stayed sealed. Families never got closure. Some even claimed they'd received static-filled calls in the middle of the night. Just breathing, then silence. I stayed at Anderson for a few years before transferring out. Now and then, though, I'd be on a late shift, and the tower would report strange radar pings far out over the Pacific, moving slowly like a plane running on fumes. Each time I'd think of Flight 739 and those 107 souls that never made it home. Even now, when I hear a distant prop plane flying over the ocean, part of me still listens for that specific tone, the old Lockheed's uneven hum. And sometimes when the weather's right and the sea fog rolls in thick, I swear I can almost hear it again, fading in and out through the static. Maybe it's just the mind playing tricks. Maybe it's something else. But if you ever find yourself near Guam on a quiet night, take a moment to listen. The ocean's full of ghosts, and some of them still haven't landed.